The morning sun cast long shadows across Whitehall as tourists began gathering around the iconic Horse Guards building. Sarah Thompson, a school teacher from Manchester, adjusted her camera strap and checked her watch. She had planned this London trip for months, and visiting the Horse Guards was at the top of her list. Her teenage daughter Emma rolled her eyes as Sarah positioned herself for the perfect photo opportunity. "Mum, you're being embarrassing again," Emma whispered, but she couldn't hide her own excitement at seeing the famous King's Guard up close. The crowd was thicker than usual that Tuesday morning in September 2024. A mixture of international tourists, local visitors, and curious passers-by had formed an almost impenetrable wall around the entrance to Horse Guards. Japanese tourists snapped selfies while German families consulted their guidebooks. American voices carried across the courtyard as people shared stories and compared photos. Marcus Rivera, a travel blogger from Barcelona, was live streaming to his followers. He had been documenting his London adventure for the past week, and his audience was particularly interested in the changing of the guard ceremonies. His phone showed over 3,000 viewers watching as he explained the history of the Horse Guards to his Spanish-speaking audience. The atmosphere was festive and relaxed. Street performers nearby added to the carnival-like feeling, with a man playing violin and a woman creating impressive soap bubbles that drifted over the crowd. Children pointed excitedly at the mounted guards, while parents tried to manage strollers and keep track of their families in the bustling space. What most tourists didn't realize was that Horse Guards wasn't just a tourist attraction. It remained an active military installation, serving as the official entrance to St. James's Palace and Buckingham Palace. The guards weren't just ceremonial figures in elaborate uniforms. They were trained soldiers with real responsibilities. Sergeant James Mitchell had been serving with the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment for 8 years. That morning, he sat atop his horse, Wellington, a magnificent black charger who had been part of ceremonial duties for 5 years. Mitchell's red tunic was immaculate, his brass buttons gleaming in the morning light. His tall, plumed helmet cast a shadow over his weathered face as he maintained the stoic expression required of his position. From his elevated position on horseback, Mitchell could see the growing crowd below. What started as a manageable group of tourists had swollen into something more challenging. People were pressing closer to the guards, some reaching out to touch the horses or pose for increasingly bold photos. He noticed parents lifting small children over the barriers and teenagers daring each other to get closer to the mounted figures. The horses, despite their training, were beginning to show signs of stress. Wellington's ears flicked nervously as camera flashes went off continuously around him. The other horses in the formation were similarly affected, with one young mare shifting restlessly under her rider's firm but gentle control. Mitchell had seen this before. Social media had transformed these ceremonial duties into something more intense than they had been in previous decades. Everyone wanted the perfect shot, the most dramatic video, the selfie that would get the most likes. What they often forgot was that the horses were living animals, not props, and the guards had genuine security responsibilities. As the morning progressed, the situation became increasingly difficult to manage. Tour groups arrived in buses, disgorging dozens of visitors at once. The narrow space around Horse Guards became crowded to the point where movement was restricted. Some tourists had clearly researched the famous incidents where guards had shouted warnings or horses had reacted to inappropriate behavior, and they seemed to be hoping to provoke a similar reaction for their cameras. A group of university students from Italy had positioned themselves directly in front of the mounted guards, taking turns posing with exaggerated expressions while their friends filmed everything. One young man kept inching closer to Wellington, despite the clearly marked boundaries and the growing tension visible in the horse's posture. Sarah Thompson found herself pushed toward the back of the crowd, unable to get the photos she had hoped for. She watched as more aggressive tourists seemed to dominate the space, some clearly crossing lines of appropriate behavior. Her daughter Emma tugged on her sleeve, looking uncomfortable with how chaotic the scene had become. The morning that had started with such promise was taking on a different character entirely. What should have been a dignified military ceremony was becoming something closer to a circus, with the guards and their horses as unwilling performers in a show they hadn't signed up for. The stage was set for the dramatic confrontation that would soon unfold, captured on dozens of cameras and shared around the world within hours. The tension in the courtyard reached a critical point just after 11 o'clock. Sergeant Mitchell felt Wellington growing more agitated beneath him as the crowd pressed ever closer. The horse's training was extensive, but even the most disciplined. Military mount had limits when surrounded by hundreds of strangers, constant camera flashes, and increasingly bold behavior from tourists who seemed to forget they were dealing with real animals and working soldiers. A family from Australia had managed to squeeze through to the front of the crowd. The father, David Chen, was trying to get his two young sons positioned for a photo when the younger boy, only 6 years old, slipped away from his father's grip. Before anyone could react, the child had ducked under the rope barrier and was running directly toward Wellington's massive hooves. Mitchell's training kicked in immediately. In one fluid motion, he gathered his reins and shifted his weight, causing Wellington to step sideways away from the child. At the same time, he called out in the commanding voice that had been drilled into him during years of service, "Stand. Back from the King's Guard!" The shout cut through the chatter of the crowd like a blade. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Camera operators froze. For a moment, there was complete silence in the courtyard as everyone processed what had just happened. The little boy stopped in his tracks, suddenly aware that he was standing alone in front of a massive horse and a soldier whose voice carried the authority of centuries of military tradition. David Chen rushed forward to scoop up his son, his face flushed with embarrassment and concern. "I'm so sorry," he called up to Mitchell, but the sergeant's expression remained fixed and professional. This wasn't about apologies. It was about maintaining order and safety in a situation that had gotten completely out of hand. Marcus Rivera, still live-streaming, had caught the entire incident on his phone. His viewer count had jumped to over 8,000 as word spread through social media that something dramatic was happening at Horse Guards. Comments flooded in from around the world, with some viewers calling for the tourists to be more respectful, while others criticized what they saw as excessive military reaction to innocent tourism. But the situation was far from over. If anything, the sergeant's shout had attracted even more attention. People began pushing forward, hoping to witness or provoke another dramatic reaction. Smartphones were held high above heads as everyone tried to capture what might happen next. The crowd had transformed from curious tourists into something resembling a mob, driven by the modern hunger for viral content. Sarah Thompson found herself pressed uncomfortably against the barrier, her daughter Emma looking frightened by the sudden change in atmosphere. "Mom, I want to leave," Emma whispered. But there were so many people around them that movement in any direction seemed impossible. They were trapped in the middle of a situation that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. The other mounted guards in the formation were dealing with their own challenges. Corporal Williams, mounted on a bay mare named Duchess, watched as tourists began testing the boundaries more boldly. A group of teenagers was daring each other to get closer, while an elderly man with a large camera was trying to photograph. The horse's tack from just inches away, apparently oblivious to the danger he was placing himself in. Behind the mounted guards, additional security personnel were beginning to take notice. Palace protection officers, usually stationed discreetly around the perimeter, started moving into more visible positions. The situation was being assessed at multiple levels, with radio communications crackling between different units responsible for security in the area. The crowd's behavior became increasingly problematic as people realized they were part of what might become a famous incident. Instead of stepping back and allowing the situation to calm down, many tourists pressed forward even more aggressively. A woman from France began arguing loudly with other visitors about who had been there first, while her husband tried to push through to get better camera angles. Wellington, despite his years of training and experience, was showing clear signs of stress. His ears were pinned back and he was beginning to prance in place, a behavior that Mitchell recognized as a warning sign. Military horses were trained to handle crowds, but they weren't immune to the kind of pressure that was building around them. The constant noise, the pressing crowd, and the aggressive behavior of some tourists were creating exactly the kind of dangerous situation that the guards' protocols were designed to prevent. Mitchell made a quick decision. Using his radio, he called for backup and reported the deteriorating situation to his commanding officer. The response was immediate and clear. If the crowd couldn't be managed through normal crowd control measures, more direct action would be authorized to ensure the safety of both the guards and the public. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be captured on dozens of cameras and shared millions of times across social media platforms. What had started as a routine ceremonial, duty was about to become a lesson in respect, boundaries, and the reality that some traditions weren't just for show. The backup arrived with military precision. 4 additional mounted guards approached from different directions, their horses moving in formation that had been practiced countless times. The sight of more guards should have been enough to encourage the crowd to step back and show appropriate respect, but the opposite happened. Even more people began pulling out their phones and cameras, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer for the day's ceremonial duties, appeared on foot alongside several palace security officers. His assessment of the situation took only moments. The crowd had grown beyond manageable size, tourists were ignoring clearly marked boundaries, and the safety of both the public and the military personnel was at risk. The decision was made to implement crowd control procedures that hadn't been necessary at Horse Guards for several years. Marcus Rivera continued his live stream, now with over 12,000 viewers watching from around the world. His commentary switched between Spanish and English as he tried to explain what was happening to his diverse audience. Many viewers were posting comments expressing shock at how tourists were behaving, while others questioned why the military response seemed so serious for what they saw as harmless photography. The first move came without warning. Sergeant Mitchell, still mounted on Wellington, received his orders through his radio earpiece. In a voice that carried across the entire courtyard, he announced, "By order of Her Majesty's Guard, this area must be cleared immediately. Step back beyond the designated barriers." Instead of compliance, the announcement seemed to trigger even more chaotic behavior. Some tourists, realizing they might miss their opportunity for photos, pushed even harder toward the front. Others began filming, more frantically, hoping to capture whatever was about to happen. The crowd had reached that dangerous tipping point where individual rational thinking gets overwhelmed by mob mentality. Sarah Thompson, still trapped in the middle of the crowd with her daughter Emma, watched in growing alarm as the situation deteriorated around them. She could see the stress in the horses' behavior and recognized that the guards weren't just putting on a show. These were real soldiers dealing with a real problem, and everyone around her seemed oblivious to the potential danger. A young man from Germany, apparently influenced by videos he had seen online of guards shouting at tourists, decided to test the boundaries deliberately. He stepped over the rope barrier and began walking directly toward one of the horses while filming himself with his phone. His friends cheered him on, treating the whole situation like entertainment rather than recognizing the serious nature of military protocol. That was the moment everything changed. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison gave a sharp hand signal, and all 5 mounted guards began moving simultaneously. It wasn't aggressive, but it was unmistakably purposeful. The horses, responding to their riders' commands, began advancing slowly but steadily toward the crowd. Wellington, despite his earlier signs of stress, moved with the disciplined precision of a military mount, his hooves clicking rhythmically on the ancient stones of the courtyard. The psychological effect was immediate and powerful. Faced with the reality of large horses moving toward them, even the most aggressive tourists suddenly understood that this wasn't a game or a photo opportunity. This was a demonstration of authority that came with the full weight of centuries of British military tradition behind it. The young German man who had crossed the barrier found himself face to face with Wellington's massive chest. Sergeant Mitchell, looking down from his position on horseback, delivered another command that left no room for misinterpretation. "Return behind the barrier immediately, or you will be removed by force." The crowd began to shift and move, but not in any organized way. Some people tried to push backward, while others surged forward, still hoping to capture dramatic footage. Parents grabbed their children and tried to move them to safety, while tour guides attempted to regain control of their groups. The result was chaos, with people pushing in different directions, and the situation becoming even more dangerous. Emma Thompson tugged desperately on her mother's arm. "Mom, I'm scared," she whispered. Sarah realized that her daughter was right to be frightened. What had started as a fun tourist activity had turned into something that felt genuinely threatening. She began trying to work her way toward the edge of the crowd, but found herself pushed back by people who were either trying to get closer to the action or were themselves trying to escape. The mounted guards continued their advance, maintaining perfect formation despite the chaos around them. Their horses moved with the steady, measured pace of animals trained for exactly this kind of situation. The guards themselves maintained their professional demeanor, but there was no mistaking the authority in their posture and the seriousness of their intent. Marcus Rivera, still broadcasting live, found himself in an interesting position. His audience had grown to nearly 15,000 viewers, and he was providing real-time commentary on a situation that was clearly escalating beyond typical tourist interactions with the King's Guard. His followers were posting comments from around the world, with many expressing disbelief at how disrespectful the tourists were being, while others questioned whether the military response was proportionate. The sound of the horses' hooves on stone seemed to grow louder as they advanced, and the psychological pressure on the crowd intensified with each step. This was no longer about getting the perfect photo or creating viral social media content. This was about recognizing authority, respecting boundaries, and understanding that some traditions came with real power behind them. The moment of truth arrived when the mounted guards reached the densest part of the crowd. Wellington, under Sergeant Mitchell's expert guidance, came to a stop directly in front of a cluster of tourists who had been among the most aggressive in pushing forward. The massive horse's presence was overwhelming at close range, and suddenly the reality of the situation hit everyone involved. A middle-aged woman from Texas, who had been loudly complaining about not being able to get good photos, found herself face-to-face with Wellington's imposing form. The horse's breath was visible in the cool morning air, and she could hear the leather of his tack creaking as he shifted his weight. For the first time since arriving at Horse Guards, she seemed to understand that she wasn't at a theme park or a museum exhibit. She was dealing with working military personnel and trained war horses. Sergeant Mitchell's voice carried clear authority as he addressed the crowd. "This is an active military installation. For your safety and ours, you will move back beyond the marked boundaries immediately. This is not a request." The German young man who had been filming himself finally lowered his phone and stepped backward, his bravado completely evaporated in the face of Wellington's imposing presence. His friends, who had been encouraging his reckless behavior moments before, were now pulling him back toward the safety of the designated tourist area. But not everyone got the message immediately. A group of university students, apparently emboldened by alcohol from an earlier pub visit, began laughing and making jokes about the situation. One of them, a young woman with bright pink hair, actually reached out toward Wellington's bridle, apparently thinking the whole display was some kind of performance put on for tourists. That was when Corporal Williams, mounted on Duchess, moved his horse directly alongside Wellington. The two massive animals now formed an intimidating wall of military precision, their riders looking down at the crowd with expressions that left no doubt about their seriousness. Williams spoke in the same clear, commanding voice that had been trained into him through years of service. "Do not touch the horses. Do not cross the barriers. Move back now." The crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The reality of being confronted by trained military horses and their riders finally broke through the social media-driven fantasy that had been driving much of the inappropriate behavior. People began stepping backward, some stumbling over each, other in their haste to put distance between themselves and the guards. Sarah Thompson, still trying to protect her daughter Emma in the chaos, felt the crowd pressure beginning to ease as people started moving away from the immediate vicinity of the horses. She could see the relief on Emma's face as space began to open up around them. What had felt like being trapped in a dangerous crowd was beginning to feel manageable again. Marcus Rivera's live stream audience had peaked at over 18,000 viewers, with comments flooding in from around the world. Many viewers were expressing support for the guards' actions, pointing out that the tourists had been behaving inappropriately and disrespectfully. Others were debating whether the military response was necessary, but the overwhelming sentiment seemed to be that the guards were simply doing their job in protecting both the public and themselves. The psychological effect of the horse's presence continued to work on the crowd. Unlike human security officers who might be argued with or ignored, there was something primal and undeniable about the authority represented by mounted soldiers. The horses themselves, despite being gentle animals by nature, represented centuries of military tradition and power that couldn't be dismissed or reasoned away. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison observed the scene with professional satisfaction. The crowd was beginning to organize itself properly, with people moving back to appropriate viewing distances and tour guides regaining control of their groups. The situation was being resolved without anyone being hurt, and without the need for more dramatic measures. However, not everyone was willing to comply immediately. A small group of teenagers, apparently more interested in creating social media content than in following instructions, continued to hover near the boundaries of acceptable behavior. One of them, a boy of about 16, kept creeping forward, with his phone, apparently hoping to get footage of himself being shouted at by the guards. Sergeant Mitchell noticed this behavior immediately. Years of experience had taught him to identify the troublemakers in any crowd, and he could see that this particular group was going to require more direct intervention. He guided Wellington toward them, the horse's massive form casting a shadow over the teenagers as they realized they were about to become the focus of military attention. The lead teenager, trying to maintain his bravado in front of his friends and his phone camera, stood his ground longer than was wise. Mitchell brought Wellington to a stop directly in front of him, the horse's head towering over the boy. When Mitchell spoke, his voice carried the full weight of military authority. "You will step back immediately, or you will be physically removed from this area." The teenager's phone shook in his hands as he finally understood that this wasn't a game. The guards weren't actors or tourist attractions. They were real soldiers with real authority, and they weren't going to tolerate disrespectful behavior regardless of how many social media followers might be watching. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The confrontation had reached its climax, and everyone present understood that the next few moments would determine whether the situation would be resolved peacefully or escalate into something more serious. The teenage boy's resolve crumbled completely when he found himself staring up at Wellington's massive form, with Sergeant Mitchell's stern gaze fixed on him from above. The reality of his situation finally penetrated through the social media bravado that had been driving his behavior. This wasn't content creation. This was a real confrontation with military authority that could have serious consequences. Without another word, the teenager stumbled backward, nearly dropping his phone in his haste to put distance between himself and the mounted guard. His friends, who had been encouraging him moments before, were now pulling him back toward the safety of the crowd. The brief moment of defiance was over, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they had pushed too far. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly as he watched the scene unfold. The mounted guards had handled the situation exactly as their training dictated. They had used the minimum force necessary to restore order while maintaining the dignity and authority of their positions. No one had been hurt, but everyone present had received a clear message about respect and boundaries. The crowd began to reorganize itself naturally. Tour guides, who had temporarily lost control of their groups in the chaos, started gathering their charges and explaining what had happened. Parents pulled their children back to safer viewing distances and began using the incident as a teachable moment about respecting authority and following rules. Sarah Thompson finally managed to work her way to the edge of the crowd with Emma. Both mother and daughter were shaken by what they had witnessed, but also oddly impressed by the professionalism they had seen from the guards. "Mum," Emma said quietly, "I didn't realize they were real soldiers. I thought they were just for show." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what her daughter meant. The elaborate uniforms and ceremonial setting had made it easy to forget that these were active military personnel with real responsibilities. The incident had been an education for everyone present about the difference between tourism and military tradition. Marcus Rivera continued his live stream, but his tone had changed significantly. Where he had started the morning treating the guards as an entertaining spectacle, he now spoke with genuine respect for what he had witnessed. His audience, now numbering over 20,000 viewers, was engaged in heated discussions about tourist behavior, military authority, and cultural respect. The horses, having served their purpose in restoring order, were guided back to their ceremonial positions by their riders. Wellington, despite the stress of the confrontation, moved with the disciplined grace that marked him as a truly professional military mount. Sergeant Mitchell patted the horse's neck approvingly, knowing that Wellington had performed his duties, perfectly under difficult circumstances. As the immediate tension began to subside, the true impact of what had happened started to become clear. Dozens of people had captured the incident on their phones and cameras, and the footage was already beginning to appear on social media platforms around the world. Within hours, the confrontation at Horse Guards would be viewed by millions of people, sparking debates about tourist behavior, military authority, and cultural respect. The palace security officers who had been monitoring the situation began to relax slightly, but they remained alert for any signs that the crowd might become problematic again. Experience had taught them that once a crowd had been agitated, it could take time for tensions to fully subside. Some tourists, chastened by what they had witnessed, began to leave the area entirely. Others, however, seemed energized by the dramatic incident and were more eager than ever to get photos and videos of the guards. The difference now was that they maintained respectful distances and followed the clearly marked boundaries. A group of elderly British visitors, who had been watching the entire incident unfold, approached some of the foreign tourists to explain the significance of what they had witnessed. "Those aren't actors," one gray-haired gentleman explained patiently to a confused family from Japan. "They're real soldiers from the household cavalry. They've been guarding the monarchy for over 300 years. The educational aspect of the incident was perhaps its most valuable outcome. Many tourists who had arrived at Horse Guards with little understanding of what they were seeing left with a much deeper appreciation for British military tradition and the serious responsibilities carried by the guards. Corporal Williams, still, mounted on Duchess, surveyed the crowd with professional satisfaction. The situation had been handled correctly, with firm authority, but without unnecessary escalation. The guards had protected both their own safety and that of the public while maintaining the dignity of their positions. As the morning progressed, toward the official changing of the guard ceremony, the atmosphere around Horse Guards had transformed completely. What had been a chaotic, disrespectful crowd had become a more orderly group of genuinely interested observers. The confrontation, dramatic as it had served its purpose in establishing proper boundaries and expectations. The incident would be discussed and analyzed for days to come, both in person among the tourists who had witnessed it and online among the millions who would view the footage. It had become an unplanned but highly effective lesson in the reality behind Britain's ceremonial traditions and the men and horses who maintain them. By noon, the incident at Horse Guards had already begun spreading across social media platforms worldwide. Marcus Rivera's live stream had been watched by over 30,000 people, and clips from his broadcast were being shared and reshared on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. The hashtags #HorseGuards, #Kingsguard, and Respect the Tradition were trending in multiple countries. Sarah Thompson and her daughter Emma had found a quiet cafe nearby where they could process what they had experienced. Emma was scrolling through social media on her phone, showing her mother the various videos and photos that were already appearing online. "Mom, look, we're actually in some of these videos," she said, pointing to footage that showed them in the crowd during the confrontation. The reaction online was overwhelmingly supportive of the guards' actions. Comments poured in from military families, British citizens, and tourists from around the world who had witnessed similar incidents at ceremonial sites. Many people shared their own stories of inappropriate tourist behavior and praised the guards for maintaining their professionalism while firmly establishing boundaries. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was conducting his post-incident debrief with the mounted guards who had participated in the crowd control operation. Each guard provided their perspective on what had happened, what had worked well, and what lessons could be learned for future situations. The consensus was that the intervention had been necessary and had been handled with exactly the right level of authority. Sergeant Mitchell, now dismounted and caring for Wellington in the stables behind Horse Guards, reflected on the morning's events. In his 8 years of service, he had seen tourism become increasingly aggressive and disrespectful. Social media had changed the nature of these interactions, with many visitors more interested in creating viral content than in showing appropriate respect for military traditions. The horses, too, were being cared for after their stressful morning. Wellington and the other mounts were being groomed, fed, and given the attention they deserved after performing their duties under difficult circumstances. The stable staff, many of whom had served with the household cavalry for decades, understood the unique pressures these ceremonial horses faced in the modern world. News outlets began picking up the story as the day progressed. The BBC ran a brief segment about tourist behavior at ceremonial sites, while international media focused on the dramatic nature of the confrontation. Travel bloggers and cultural commentators began weighing in with their opinions about the balance between tourism and tradition. The German teenager who had been at the center of the confrontation found himself becoming an unwitting internet celebrity. His friends had posted videos of the incident from multiple angles, and he was being recognized and commented on everywhere he went in London. The experience had been a harsh but effective lesson in the consequences of disrespectful behavior. David Chen, the Australian father whose young son had initially triggered the guards' intervention, spent the rest of his London vacation explaining to his children why the guards had acted as they did. He used the incident as a teaching moment about respecting authority, following rules, and understanding that some things are more serious than they might initially appear. The tour guides who regularly brought groups to Horse Guards began incorporating the incident into their presentations. They explained to future visitors what had happened and why, using it as an example of the importance of showing proper respect when visiting ceremonial military sites. The story became part of the ongoing education about British traditions and military heritage. In the weeks that followed, the video footage of the incident was viewed millions of times around the world. It became a case study in cultural respect, tourist behavior, and the authority of traditional institutions in the modern world. University courses on tourism, military history, and cultural studies began using the incident as an example of the complex interactions between tradition and contemporary society. The palace security services used the incident to review and update their crowd control procedures. While the guards had handled the situation perfectly, the experience highlighted the growing challenges posed by social media-driven tourism and the need for clear protocols when dealing with increasingly aggressive crowd behavior. For Sergeant Mitchell and his fellow guards, the incident became a reminder of why their traditions and protocols existed. They weren't just ceremonial displays for tourists. They were practical systems developed over centuries to maintain order, ensure safety, and preserve the dignity of institutions that had served the nation for generations. The horses, perhaps most remarkably, seemed to have taken the incident in stride. Wellington and his stablemates returned to their regular duties with the same professionalism they had always shown. Their training and temperament had been tested under pressure, and they had proved once again why they were considered among the finest ceremonial horses in the world. As autumn progressed and the incident faded from the immediate news cycle, its impact continued to resonate. Tourist behavior at horse guards became noticeably more respectful as visitors arrived already aware of the expectations and consequences. The guards' firm but professional response had created a lasting change in the atmosphere around the historic site. The incident had demonstrated that in an age of social media and instant global communication, respect for tradition and authority remained not only relevant, but essential. The King's Guard had forcefully moved tourists aside, not out of aggression or intolerance, but out of a commitment to maintaining the standards and dignity that had defined their service for centuries. In doing so, they had provided a powerful reminder that some things remain sacred, regardless of how much the world around them might change.